Good evening, and thank you so much for joining us for Meet the Makers this evening. We are talking about the docuseries Pulling the Thread, Unraveling Conspiracy Theories. My name is Tina Martin. I'm the host of the Local USA series on WGBH World Channel, and I'm also an associate professor of journalism at Boston University's College of Communication. We are so fortunate this evening. We're going to have a great conversation. We'll be with you for about an hour, and we do have the filmmakers for this docuseries. We have Kristin Pichaske, who is here. We're going to pull Kristin up, hopefully, and Danny Alpert. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the two of them, as well as the series, just so you have a little bit of information. And we're hoping that you will engage with us and ask questions, and we are going to try to get to as many of your questions as possible. There's Danny. Hi, Danny. Hi, Kristin. How are you?
Hi, Tina. How are you?
Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let me read a little bit about these two phenomenal talents, and then we can talk a little bit about the film, and I will just tell you briefly about the actual series. Let me just tell you a little bit about it. Pulling the Thread is a digital documentary series and engagement campaign that unravels some of America's most popular conspiracy theories and reveals the emotional, cognitive, and social forces that lead rational people to believe irrational things. And so Kristin Pichaske has directed and produced dozens of award-winning documentaries, features, series, and digital shorts, including most recently Legal Lens, an Emmy-nominated series for the Boston Globe, Veterans Coming Home, a cross-platform storytelling initiative created in collaboration with public television stations across the country, and of course, Pulling the Thread. We are going to look at 2 episodes this evening. Danny Alpert is an award-winning producer, director, and leader in using media for change. He recently directed No Small Matter, which has hosted over 1,200 community screenings across the U.S. after its release in late 2018. Past films include Radical Grace, winner of Audience Awards at Hot Docs and AFI Film Festivals, The Calling, that's a PBS independent lens, At Home, and A Doula Story, which also aired on PBS. So welcome to both of you.
Thank you. Thank you. Pleasure for us to be here.
Absolutely. So, Kristin, let's talk about the inspiration behind this series. Talk to us about how this came about.
Well, it's actually Danny who came to me initially and said, I've always wanted to make a film about conspiracy theorists. And you'll correct me if I'm wrong, I'm sure, Danny, but there's a curiosity there about what makes people become not only believers, but really going down the rabbit hole, so to speak, when it comes to conspiracy theories. And we were having this discussion in the wake of the 2016 election, when everyone was suddenly noticing the problem with fake news and misinformation online and conspiracy theories. And so it really started there and then kind of grew over time to be not just a character and story-based film, like much of the work that we do, but more of a deep dive into the cognitive science. What is it about our brains that makes conspiracy theories so alluring to us and makes us less rational than maybe we like to think?
Yeah, and I think that if I can follow up, it's the reason it came to me was that I was encountering conspiracy thinking, which is really what the series is about, getting at what Kristin was saying about how our brains work and how we think in a way that leads us down the path to conspiracy theories. But I was encountering conspiracy thinking in my own family, in my own friend group, and I'll be full disclosure, these are people who lean to the left, and it's normally seen as something that's more leans to the right. And so I was really sort of curious about that it's something that we're all really susceptible to, this kind of thinking. And that was sort of the impetus to go down this path to see what it is about human beings that makes us this way.
And so how did you kind of determine in your creation stage who you were going to talk to?
Well, I think, it really was led by what we began to learn about the cognitive foibles that we have. And then connecting cognitive foibles to conspiracy theories, the most popular conspiracy theories, and in our society, in American society, that was the leader that sort of brought us to the episode subjects, and then based on that, it really was, finding the people who had the most expertise in this particular area or had done the studies in this particular area, as we'll get a chance later to talk to Joe Uscinski. And that was what led us to the people that we spoke to.
And what was the process like in talking with these folks? Was it easy to get them to kind of say, what they said in the piece, or did it take some prodding? Kristin, you're smiling.
Yeah, that's a good question. Everyone was really, really lovely and forthcoming. I think the challenge was getting people to agree to an interview in the first place, because there is a certain amount of paranoia that exists in certain communities who really embrace conspiracy theories and conspiracy thinking strongly, and also legitimately because there are a lot of there have been some hatchet jobs, and many of these people had experienced interviews with people where they felt like they weren't very well represented. And so sort of building a bit of trust was the initial challenge. And I would say once we sat down with everyone, they were really lovely and gracious and open. And I should say also, many of the people we interviewed were believers, but many were also academics and sort of quote unquote experts, historians, political scientists, psychologists, people who are really coming at it from more of an academic standpoint.
And so among the believers, was there a common thread?
I would say there were several. One of the episodes we're not focusing on tonight really talks about intuition versus reason as a way that people think and form their worldviews. And Eric Oliver, who's a professor at the University of Chicago, has done some interesting research that suggests that conspiracy theorists tend to be people who think with their gut. So they are much more inclined to all sorts of what he calls magical thinking, whether it's superstitions, conspiracy thinking, things that just resonate with them emotionally and are a little less rooted in facts and figures, which is not to say that they're entirely more susceptible to misinformation than everyone else, just that things that really resonate with their gut are the things that they tend to believe and go with. And we definitely saw that. We definitely saw that in the people that we interviewed. In fact, we often would ask them some of the questions that Professor Oliver used on his survey, and across the board, they were answering in exactly the way he predicted.
So there was
That's episode 3, right? That's 4. Sorry, episode 4. For those people who want to check it out later about intuition versus rational.
And how much of a part did you said you talked to psychologists and experts, how much of a part did they play in either debunking or kind of explaining, why people feel the way that they feel?
They were really the drivers of those conversations. They could really sort of get behind and go deeply into, the reasons that people think the way that they do, and sort of the history, both cognitively, psychologically, and in terms of sociology and other disciplines, to really sort of connect the dots. I mean, one of the things about conspiracy theories is that they're often about connecting the dots of things that can't be connected or can't definitively be connected. And our experts really were able to connect the dots between the conspiracy theories and the sort of science behind them.
No, I think the interesting thing about being someone who is a filmmaker or someone who creates is that even in the process, you may have a preconceived notion about something or a thought process, and then it changes after you finish your piece. Did that happen for either of you?
Definitely, in many ways. I think understanding the profile of someone who has strong conspiracy thinking instincts, my vision of that really changed. It's not people in their basements who have no social life, et cetera, et cetera. It's really a different mix of factors. Doesn't really depend much on political party, doesn't depend much on education level. So there are a lot of myths out there, I think, about who believes in conspiracy theories and who doesn't. And I think for sure the most illuminating thing was just understanding how irrational I am and my friends, my family. over time, I think we both really began catching ourselves believing things because we wanted to believe them, or they fit our preconceived notions. And I definitely would say that I consume information and media much differently now.
I think that the difference, perhaps a little bit of the difference between Kristin and I in this is definitely we both are catching ourselves. I think I probably come from a place that I am in some ways more of an intuitionist in some ways, and than Kristin is, and so I think I could sort of see that even in myself, and sort of catch myself. But I think even more so, it's like, what do you do with that? And I think it's not enough just to be able to identify it. The point of being able to identify it and see it in yourself or in your peers or in your family is to be able to do something about it. And that's definitely something that has changed for me. I don't think I would have been nearly as vocal as I have been in the last year about this. I would say, oh, you're entitled to your belief, or, oh, this person is a little nutty. I don't know if I want to go down that. But now I'm much more interested in engaging people and saying, oh, well, why do you think that? And sort of looking at trying to point out to them the sort of the thinking that goes into that, and maybe make them more aware as well.
Now, we have more than 300 people here who have joined us and who have many questions for you. I'm going to do my very best to move us along in terms of questions. We have about 3 minutes, so we're going to have one question. This is from Carmen. Carmen asks, and you hit on this a little bit, how did this series impact you as a storyteller? Was it difficult to separate your point of views from this kind of content?
That's a good question. It was very difficult. And I think a big challenge for me, at least, was that it's ultimately a very information-driven series. I think a lot of the work that Danny and I have done in the past is very character and story-driven, sort of verite style narratives. And here it was really about synthesizing a lot of information, coming up with sort of a central thesis, if you will, for each episode. And really constructing that in a much more heavy-handed way than we've ever done in the past. And so I think that's always really challenging. It was a challenging shift in style. It was extremely challenging to try and be objective. I think we wrote about 40 versions of every script by the time we were done. And it was just a really labor-intensive process that I think for me, part of the goal was to really, I've become sort of obsessed with, how can you marry sort of artistic filmmaking tools and strategies and approaches with the digital world where, sometimes a 3-minute explainer video is what will really have the most social impact. And so the biggest challenge of all was really trying to marry those things together. And I feel like it was a learning process and one that I would iterate on in the future, but that was the biggest challenge for me.
All right, we have got to get to episode 1. We're going to look at episode 1, and then after that, we will be joined by Dr. Joe Uscinski, who is a political scientist at the University of Miami. So let's look at episode 1. Is episode 1 ready to play? If not, we will ask a few more questions.
Conspiracy theories. They're everywhere you look. And whether they're true or not, they can have real consequences.
Engaging with conspiracy theories promotes alienation and disengagement from society.
When we don't trust the institutions and we don't trust our information sources, what does that mean for democracy?
Who's to blame for the flood of conspiracy theories in America? The real dark mastermind behind conspiracy thinking is us.
All of us are susceptible. Everybody does it, left and right. It's a product of our brains.
It's the ultimate inside job. I'm Cara Santamaria, and I'm here to take you on a journey inside your own brain, to look at why conspiracy theories are so alluring, and how to resist the explosion of misinformation in your newsfeed. America, it's time to think about how we think. Have you ever suffered a really big loss that made you feel anxious and helpless? Did you find yourself searching for excuses? Maybe it wasn't your fault. Maybe someone else cheated.
You cannot be serious!
Psychologists tell us that losing is a common trigger for conspiracy thinking.
We don't want to take the fall for a loss. We want a scapegoat. And that's often what conspiracy theories do, it's a way to help people deal with disappointment.
Every 4 years, millions of Americans experience a pretty big collective loss.
I so wish that I had been able to fulfill your hopes.
In fact, there's no better petri dish for studying conspiracy thinking than a presidential election, especially that one in 2016.
So I thought by studying conspiracy theories, this would be wacky. And then you realize that it's super predictable.
This is Joe Parent. He and his colleague Joe Uscinski conducted a study that answers a hotly contested question. Which political party is most guilty of conspiracy thinking? If you're thinking, wait, isn't the answer obvious? You're probably wrong. Here's what Parent and Uscinski found. Before an election, both parties tend to be equally paranoid about a conspiracy to rig the vote. After the election, one side is more convinced that it was rigged. The losing side. It's like a switch gets flipped. You think the other side is cheating right up until you win. And then, like magic, that thinking diminishes. But if you lose...
If you're on the side that loses, you have less control or no control. In our current society, with this extreme polarization, the side that's in control is so different from you. They don't have your values. They don't have your back, and that becomes terrifying.
In a paradoxical way, conspiracy theories might be reassuring. They say there is this terrible conspiracy that's out to get us, but they're saying we understand it. If we just realize the truth of it and understand it, then potentially we can overcome it.
That need for reassurance doesn't go away after the election. It continues for the next 4 years. Parent and Uscinski analyzed more than a century of public discussion in the media, and they found a consistent pattern. The party of conspiracy thinking was always the party that was out of power.
The party of the president is the best predictor of where conspiracy theories are going to be coming. George W. Bush was president. 9/11 was an inside job. Halliburton and Dick Cheney were running the White House to make money off the invasion of Iraq. Likewise, when Barack Obama was elected president, suddenly a number of people thought he was a Muslim and he wasn't a citizen. You want an explanation that tells you what went wrong and how to fix it, and draw your group together to deal with that challenge. Conspiracy theories fulfill all those functions.
The 2016 election felt like a conspiracy palooza. But was it really worse than usual, or did it just follow the same old pattern? Let's look at the evidence. Before the election, both parties harbored conspiracy theories about the vote being rigged.
And I'm afraid the election's going to be rigged, I have to be honest.
But researchers at PolitiFact say there was no evidence of foul play.
We looked at voter fraud again and again and again. Millions of people casting fraudulent ballots. There's zero evidence for that.
Then, after the election...
Now it's Clinton supporters, quote, urging us to do something, anything, to investigate claims that the election results were hacked.
We've seen an increase in Democratic conspiracy theories in circulation.
Did Trump's inaugural team funnel money to Trump?
Some of the allegations may prove to be true, but what we can say is that many claims have already been made that were clearly unsupported by the evidence at the time the claim was made.
The Trump campaign actively supported the Russian government's attacks on Hillary Clinton.
Don Jr. collusion between the campaign and a foreign power.
The fantasy is that once we find out that Trump colluded with the Russians, our nightmare will be over. Somehow, magically.
This is the beginning of the end for Donald Trump.
And this is another hallmark of conspiracy thinking. Conspiracy thinking is when people become obsessed with what's hidden, with secrets, rather than what's out in the open. The truth.
So the losing side of the 2016 election predictably followed the script, but the winning side, that's where things broke from the norm. Conspiracy thinking dropped a little bit among Republicans after the election, but 30% still believed it was rigged. And that 30% includes the winner himself.
Trump wrote on Twitter, "I won the popular vote if you deduct the millions of people who voted illegally."
I've never seen anything like that in American politics. We rated it our worst rating, pants on fire.
This is not typical. Even the winners are still neck deep in conspiracy thinking years after the election.
They're
shadowy cabal within the U.S. government.
This deep state is truly operating to damage this president.
Deep state conspiracy again. Trump will crush this cabal by throwing them all in jail, starting with Hillary Clinton.
What is going on? Could it be that Americans from both political parties somehow feel like losers?
People feel betrayed by society, by the economy, by the political process.
Corruption, violence, the looming obsolescence of work.
There's a lot of instability going on that leads to people feeling insecure, which leads to conspiracy theories.
In fact, Parent and Uscinski's research showed that conspiracy thinking spikes during turbulent times.
We create conspiracy theories because they're still a little bit reassuring in a world that's just too frightening and awful if you confront it head on.
Social media amplifies those fears with a steady stream of content that vilifies our enemies and undermines our trust.
People have much more negative views of the other party than they used to. That's going to make them more vulnerable to misinformation.
It's like we're stuck in this self-reinforcing loop of fear, finger-pointing, and fake news. How do we get off this train before the next election arrives? We can't just fix conspiracy thinking with an app or with better journalism. We have to fix the way we think.
We need to know why we believe the things we do. We need to understand our biases and how they shape our beliefs, and potentially how we can overcome our biases.
That's what this series is all about. In our next episode, we'll look at one of America's most popular conspiracy theories and explode the biggest myth of all, that human beings are mostly rational.
Welcome back. We want to welcome Dr. He is, hi Joe, Dr. Joe Uscinski. How are you?
Hi, nice to be here.
And we just saw you in the film and now you're here. Okay, so Dr. Uscinski is an associate professor of political science at the University of Miami. He studies public opinion and mass media with a focus on conspiracy theories. He is the co-author of American Conspiracy Theories, Oxford 2014, and the editor of Conspiracy Theories and the People Who Believe Them, also in Oxford. That was 2018. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
What I was getting, well, mind you, I just want to remind everyone at home that you can certainly put your questions in, and I will do my very best to get all of your questions answered as we go on. I know there are so many of you. Just wanted to ask you a very quick question, Joe, and then we'll go back to our participant questions because I know they're here to really talk to you guys. What I was seeing in that episode is a connection between conspiracy theories and stress. Is that something that you have found directly in your research?
It's a lot of these psychological factors. It's tough to show a relationship between them and conspiracy beliefs. And in fact, the studies are going in both directions right now. And I guess one example I'll give that's very quick is that I started polling on conspiracy theories right at the beginning of the pandemic. And I figured that, you know, as the pandemic went on and became a real thing in this country, that the stress of it would cause conspiracy beliefs to go through the roof. It's like putting people in a room and cranking every knob up to 11. But when I went back and repolled a few months later, you figured all of these beliefs would be up to the roof, but they weren't. And a lot of this was very stable. So I think for people who have high levels of conspiracy thinking, stress could trigger them. But if somebody's not a conspiracy thinker, it's not going to get them there on its own.
Now, I have a question here from Jessica, and I'm actually going to pose it to filmmakers and to Joe. Jessica is asking, how do you come up with the first questions to ask experts? So, Kristin, I'm going to ask you that, and then Joe, on the flip side, I'm going to ask you what you anticipate for someone like a Kristin to ask you when they come to talk to you about conspiracy theories. So, Kristin, you go first.
So in a perfect world, and certainly in the case of this series, I've already interviewed everyone who's going to be interviewed, or somebody has pre-interviewed everyone who's going to be interviewed. We've read their books, we've read their articles, so we have a pretty good idea of their research, their beliefs, and the kinds of things that they're likely to say. So that list of questions is really customized for each person we interview based on how we think they fit into the story. And beyond that, I would say it's, you know, you want to be able to have a conversation. So there's always a list of questions going in, but ideally you deviate from that quite a bit. Like maybe you have 5 things you want to hit on, but it's really a back and forth. lots of follow-up questions, and usually starting with the easy ones so that everybody has a little time to relax and get comfortable before we start digging into the, more difficult or more complicated questions.
And so what is the difficult question? Because that's what the experts are for, right, Joe? I mean, you know your stuff, so you can handle the difficult questions. So what is the difficult question when it comes to, or what was the difficult question when it came to the series for the experts?
I think everybody is really well versed in talking about their research, the things that they've studied, the things that they can state for a fact. It's a lot harder, and most academics in particular really don't like to use conjecture. They really want to have facts and data and something peer reviewed and so on. And so, and of course, research doesn't keep up to the current moment always. So I think the thing that people had the most trouble with was trying to apply a study they did a year ago to the current phenomena, which when we were doing these interviews, it was evolving very quickly from the time that Trump took office. A number of conspiracy theories came and went, and the conspiracy landscape evolved a lot, and it's hard to always know what's going on just in the last few months because you haven't had a chance to study it yet.
Okay, and Joe, what is the question that you're kind of like cringing when someone like Kristin knocks at your door?
So that's a good question. I've taken I kept track this summer, and I think I've done more than 150 interviews with reporters talking about conspiracy theories. And for the last month, it's been almost exclusively questions about QAnon. And the questions that I don't like are ones that sort of build the answer into the question, where a reporter might say, "Why is this growing so big so fast?" And I say, "Well, is it really growing big and fast?" And I sort of like the interviews where, we let the data do the talking rather than starting with, what the rest of the journalists think.
And Danny, did you want to add to that before I get to another question?
Yeah, I think that gets exactly. I mean, I was anticipating that the why is the tough question, not the what or the how. The why is the hard question, and I think that's exactly why in the case of the episode that we just watched, the why, that question about how people feel, was not directed at researchers, but it was directed at Prudy, who is an analyst and a psychologist. She's a person who deals every day with the feelings. So, and why we feel this way. So I think the why questions are best. I think, it's hard to ask the data people the why questions. So that's the question to be afraid of, so to speak.
Be very afraid. All right, so we have folks who are not only joining us here on this webinar, they're joining us from YouTube. And this is a question from Tony. Tony wants to know, did you find yourself believing any conspiracy theories, or at least questioning long-held beliefs while producing this series? Thank you, Tony.
A little bit. I mean, as we mentioned earlier, I've caught myself believing the latest political conspiracy theory that I wouldn't have even thought was a conspiracy theory. It's just something people are talking about on social media. But I had a really interesting experience. I spent the weekend at a JFK assassination conference filled with true believers. And I knew, because I'd been in touch with the organizer, that the volunteers were all getting together to set things up the night before. So I checked in that day and went and said hello and met everyone. And they were really lovely people. I mean, I think to begin with, the JFK assassination conspiracy theory is the one that the highest percentage of people believe. It strikes me as being the most plausible of any of the ones that we really looked closely at. And it was just a really warm, lovely atmosphere. A lot of these people knew each other, and they'd been coming to this conference every year, sharing research and so on and so forth, very earnestly seeking the truth. It's a really interesting experience to spend a weekend when you're surrounded by people who all 100% to their core believe this. It's really hard to not start to feel like, okay, well, if I'm not so sure about this, but I'm the only one, maybe this is something that I should rethink.
Mm-hmm. And what about you, Danny?
Not really.
No. Okay.
Short answer.
And so, Joe, watching this film, what was your response as someone who studies this? You're actually part of it. Your research contributed to it, or your data. In watching the whole series, what were some of your thoughts?
Well, it's really important that documentaries like this be made that take a sober look at the topic. And the reason is because they're, and not to go too meta, but there's a lot of misinformation about misinformation. There's a lot of seeming conspiracy theories about why people believe conspiracy theories. So trying to cut through some of that and get to the, both to the research side of it and to the very human aspects of it is something that we very much need right now.
And I would imagine we have about 4 minutes. I would imagine it's hard to do this, but Herb wants to know, how does one challenge the beliefs of a conspiracy believer? Anybody want to take that? Joe, do you want to take it?
Not easily. If someone has their heels dug in on a particular belief, it's going to be very difficult to change their mind, and you're not going to be able to do it with a link. But if it's somebody who just happened to see an idea and says, hey, this might be real, those are the people you can more easily persuade away from a conspiracy theory.
But Kristin, did you want to persuade, or Danny, you can take this one. Did you, the goal here was not to necessarily persuade anybody to do anything, right?
It was broader persuasion about how you consume information and being skeptical in the right ways. And I think what we found in talking to experts of all stripes is that empathy is really important. And I think that's such a good lesson for all forms of misinformation that we might be trying to debunk. So our whole approach was not to pathologize conspiracy thinking, because it really is human nature, but to try and send a message that was reasonably empathetic. This is, we're all susceptible to believing things that aren't true. Here are the reasons why that have to do with biology, evolution, etc., the way our brains are wired. We all do it. So, instead of criticizing, let's try to understand ourselves a little bit. We always use the language of we. I do it, you do it, we do it. Let's try to understand our brains in a way that, in a broader sense, we can perhaps try to be a little bit more rational than we are today.
Danny, did you want to add something there?
Just, I think that what Joe is saying is right, that there's you're not gonna, it's somebody who's really, a true believer. You're not gonna be able to convince them that otherwise. And part of it is that there's and this is also a psychological or a cognitive foible that we have, where becomes a vicious circle of self-reinforcement around the beliefs that we already have, and that we look for things to bolster those beliefs, already. So as Kristin is saying, widening it out, not to be necessarily about the conspiracy itself or the idea or the belief itself, but something broader, and to engage people empathetically and listen to them, and which can be difficult, and sort of try to find the way to engage them in a broader conversation about this issue, as opposed to the facts, so to speak, about the specific belief that they have.
Right. And with that, let's take a look at episode 2.
There are a million films that investigate whether the JFK assassination was a conspiracy. This is not one of them. This is an investigation into why so many people are still debating the JFK assassination more than 50 years later. The answers tell us a lot about why we believe conspiracy theories, and anything else for that matter. It turns out our brains have evolved these fascinating quirks that prime us for conspiracy thinking. All we need is the right set of circumstances to set us off.
President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago.
In episode 1, we learned that conspiracy theories can be tools for dealing with loss and anxiety. And few events created a bigger sense of loss for America than Kennedy's assassination. How could we possibly feel safe if our government couldn't even protect its own president?
Every time the government fails to predict an attack, there is a conspiracy theory. Americans say, how could they have failed so badly? Perhaps they were actually in on it.
The JFK assassination set off alarm bells in our brains. Something just didn't feel right.
That is intuitively unsatisfying, to say that a lone gunman could get out of bed one day and change the course of history. And so we go looking for bigger explanations and a vast, faceless, all-powerful conspiracy that fits with our intuition that such a big event must have had a big cause.
Cognitive scientists have a name for this intuition. They call it proportionality bias, the tendency to believe that a cause must be equal in magnitude to the effect. Most of the time, small efforts yield small results, and big efforts yield big results. So our brains assume this relationship holds true, even when it doesn't.
JFK, you know, the leader of the free world, is assassinated by who? Some lone nut never heard of? Here's JFK, here's Oswald. There's an imbalance there, so you have to balance it.
This man, James Fetzer, says there were no fewer than 6 gunmen in Daley Plaza.
Of the 4 shots that hit JFK, the first was fired from the top of the county records building. The second was fired from the inside of the triple underpass. The third shot was fired from the Dow Tex. The fourth shot fired from the intersection of the triple underpass and the picket fence.
Pretty soon, Madison Square Garden couldn't fit everybody that was involved in the JFK, but that kind of balances it out.
By contrast, let's consider a different day and a different lone gunman.
The president was hit. Shots were fired, apparently at President Reagan as he was coming out of the Washington.
The attempted assassination of Ronald Reagan was a similar event in all regards, except that the president survived. It was a smaller event in terms of its outcome, and therefore we're satisfied with smaller explanations. And so there have been almost no conspiracy theories about the attempted assassination of Ronald Reagan, either at the time or subsequently.
After proportionality bias primes us for conspiracy thinking, another mental shortcut helps us confirm our suspicions. Once we form a belief, we cling to it no matter the facts. It's called confirmation bias, and study after study shows that we all experience it all the time. In one study, people were asked whether they thought the JFK assassination was a conspiracy. Then they were shown a mix of evidence, both for and against. Both sides claimed that the same evidence confirmed their beliefs. Each side trusted the data that supported their theory and discounted data that didn't.
Our minds operate more like lawyers than scientists. You know, the point of a lawyer is to defend your client to the best of your ability, even if that means distorting evidence, burying evidence, slanting evidence.
We evolved confirmation bias for a good reason. Most of what was true yesterday is still true today. And if we changed our minds every time a new piece of information came our way, our heads would explode. But in today's world of alternative facts, it's a little too easy to find evidence that confirms any hunch. The JFK assassination has produced thousands of public documents that can be scanned for confirming evidence, like this photo of the presidential motorcade at the time of the assassination. Here in the background is the doorway to the Dallas Book Depository. Who is this blurry figure? Some say it looks an awful lot like Lee Harvey Oswald, which would be significant because at this moment, he should be 6 flights up shooting the president.
Lee Oswald was framed. We've even been able to prove that he was actually standing in the doorway of the book depository.
But to a lot of cognitive scientists, this connection shows another quirk in our brains called patternicity.
So patternicity is the tendency to find meaningful patterns in both meaningful and meaningless noise. The reason for this is that our brains are pattern-seeking devices.
And it took them millions of years of evolution to get that way.
Imagine you're a hominid 3 million years ago, and you hear a rustle in the grass. What is that? Is it just the wind, or is it a dangerous predator? If you assume that pattern, that noise, is a dangerous predator and turns out it's just the wind, that's a low-cost error to make. You just become more vigilant and cautious. But if you assume that the rustle in the grass is just the wind and it turns out it's a dangerous predator, congratulations, your lunch. So it's a good thing to assume patterns are real.
We oversee patterns because it helped us survive when quick decisions meant life or death. But it also leads us to connect dots that aren't really connected. I mean, is this photo a clue to cracking the JFK conspiracy? Or is it Billy Lovelady, a guy who was laying flooring at the book depository that day in 1963? He and several witnesses testified to the Warren Commission that it was him in the photo. All of us, left, right, street smart, and book smart, have the same cognitive quirks baked into our brains, just waiting for the right set of circumstances to send us down the conspiracy rabbit hole. But there's one more element any good conspiracy theory requires that doesn't live in our brains.
The new president, Lyndon Johnson, appointed a commission to investigate who killed Kennedy.
When the assassination happened, LBJ suspected people would blame the Russians, and it would lead to a nuclear war. So he tried to hurry the inquiry through, and so when people feel that it wasn't done entirely properly, they're onto something.
That rushed investigation planted the seeds of suspicion. Then, a few years later,
People have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
Watergate spurred a number of investigations by the press and Congress that then disclosed a whole lot of other real government conspiracies.
by the late 70s, the percentage of Americans who believe JFK conspiracy theories spiked at over 80%. In 2017, when the government finally unsealed more classified JFK documents, it only made some people more suspicious.
Some of this material is still redacted, and you're not really seeing a meaningful effort on their part to tell the truth.
Conspiracies happen, and governments keep secrets. So how do we know where to draw the line between being prudent and being paranoid? More on that in our next episode.
When you have your grandfather telling you about growing up in Mississippi or Alabama and how the white doctors did A, B, and C, automatically in your brain, you're gonna be thinking like, I can't trust these people.
Right, welcome back. Welcome back. We're going to try to get to these questions because we have some very engaged folks who want to ask questions of our two filmmakers and our expert here. Susan wants to know, and this is actually an interesting question, how important did you find the media environment of the period in explaining the conspiracy theories and the spread of those theories at any given time?
I think that's a good question for Joe. I know you can answer this one.
There seems to be conspiracy theories all the time. So people will communicate with whatever means are available to them. I often hear that, you know, this is the age now of conspiracy theories, but we tend to say that every year. And we've said that every year going back decades. So it seems like it's always the time, but it's not a product of social media. It's not a product of newspapers or books or cable TV. It's part of the human condition, and it's whatever form communication will take in the future, there will be conspiracy theories there too.
And a question from Diane. Do either one of you, Kristin or Danny, want to chime in on that before we go to the next question?
I think that sums it up.
Okay. All right. All right. So Diane wants to know, what did you learn about what conspiracy theory believers say about the impact their views have had on relationships and friendships? That's very interesting. I'll stop right there. It's a two-part question, but let's start with that part because that's very interesting.
I interviewed the two really hardcore conspiracy theorists we interviewed. It's hard to even summarize the impact it's had on their relationships. Their immediate families, and in one case, one of their wives was not happy about all the time being spent investigating conspiracy theories. And at a certain point, you know, lawsuits were being brought and things were starting to get really challenging for them and their families. So it wasn't great in that context, but at the same time, they definitely had a community of fellow researchers and a sense of purpose. Many of them have, like GoFundMe campaigns where other believers will help fund their research. They get a podium and have a voice, and sometimes very large audiences online. So I think on the whole, people are, most of the conspiracy believers we talk to gained a sense of community because of their beliefs. I did speak to one person who didn't end up being in the series, but he was one of those very noteworthy conspiracy theorists with a big microphone and a lot of people on YouTube following him. And he actually did change his mind. He was very much a 9/11 truther and went on a reality TV show in the UK aimed at proving that it actually wasn't a conspiracy, and it worked. He changed his mind. And he was in a heap load of trouble because all of the people who followed him believed suddenly that he, had been co-opted by the dark forces and was a traitor. And I think that was an extremely difficult position to be in.
And, I actually have a question. We're going to try to get as many of the questions from our participants as possible, but this is for any of you. How much did you find someone's social, economic background, ethnicity, how much did that, kind of weave into the ideas that they held?
So one thing I find in surveys is that conspiracy theorizing is an equal opportunity sport. So regardless of race, gender, one of my colleagues here likes to say they walk among us. So it really could be anyone. And that prototypical person you have in your mind, that middle-aged white guy living in the basement with a ham radio, that's just not it. It's anyone. For demographics, the big predictors, I would say, are education and income. But again, they're not perfect predictors. They're just talking about averages across the population. And it's not really clear if education makes people less conspiratorial in their thinking, or if having more money makes you less conspiratorial. It could be the exact opposite. I mean, imagine if you were hiring a important position at your company and somebody walks in and says, I think there's some shadowy force out to get all of us. You may not hire that person into that job. So it could be working both ways, and that's something that we're still trying to figure out.
And so how many folks had, when it came to conspiracy theories, Dr. Uscinski, you have tons of data research. Did you find, Kristin, Danny, that those folks had that same, in their, to their estimation, data research to back up their theories?
I would say definitely people agreed that it's an equal opportunity thing. We did talk to some folks who discussed the idea of being marginalized. They were sort of connecting that sense of being disempowered to conspiracy thinking. And there does seem to be some research to support that. As well as things like our third episode has to do with conspiracy theories about HIV, which we know are more widely believed among people of color, and particularly African Americans, for good reason, because there have been a number of medical conspiracy theories and really poor treatment of African Americans by the medical establishment. So in that case, we felt that it was a pretty rational in many respects, set of beliefs that is rooted in a sense that that system can't be trusted because it has a history of not being trustworthy. And I think there were some folks that we talked to who broadened that out to, the more power you have, the less likely you are to believe in conspiracy theories.
That's a very interesting point, Joe. The more power you have, the less likely you are to believe in conspiracy theories. Is that something that you've explored in your research at all?
Well, sure, in the sense that if people are well-to-do, well-educated in the higher echelons of society, they tend to engage in less conspiracy thinking. Mm-hmm. Immediately, Trump comes to my mind, and he would be sort of the counterexample. But here's the thing with him is I don't know what he believes, and I don't think he knows what he believes. And I wouldn't call him a conspiracy theorist, right? I would call him someone who weaponizes conspiracy theories for political gain. I don't think he really believes any of the things that he says. So in that sense, powerful people can use these as tools for political advantage, which we see him doing quite a bit, without actually believing them.
And so when we talk about something like COVID, because I'm a journalist and, we've all read, the president's comments on COVID-19 when it first appeared, that, he was quoted as saying it was a hoax. So in that case, is that sparking, the flames for people who would have, the proclivity or propensity to think of things as conspiracy theories?
Yeah, so immediately after he said that, we polled the country on their beliefs in COVID conspiracy theories, and the people who believed it was being exaggerated to hurt the president were people who were Republicans, Trump supporters, and people who paid close attention to the things that Trump said.
Mm-hmm.
So he was able to influence people to adopt these beliefs. And the really bad part was that the people who then adopted these beliefs were less likely to engage in best practices regarding the pandemic. So they weren't socially distancing and wearing masks and washing hands.
And that's the vicious cycle, a different example of the vicious cycle that's in there, where people who are believing in conspiracy theories tend to withdraw from civic participation, withdraw from responsible behavior in this kind of, to use the example that Joe is bringing up, and that is another vicious cycle that's sort of always there in the world of conspiracy thinking.
And there's another question here from Barry, who says, this kind of goes along with what we're saying. Where do you draw the line between conspiracy thinking and flat out lying?
I think it comes down to this question of, do you believe it or not, right? If you actually believe, and there are many people out there who earnestly believe this stuff, then it's not lying. But there is clearly a cottage industry of people who have figured out that they can get a lot of clicks or a lot of votes. There are all sorts of things to be gained financially, in terms of power, in terms of voice, by embracing conspiracy theory. So it's really hard to tell the people who are lying from the people who are true believers.
And that's really the most dangerous part in some ways in our current moment, at least to my mind, is that, as Joe said, there are people, plenty, and Kristin as well, it's like plenty of people who have figured out how to gain, personally gain, politically gain, financially gain from this very human behavior and reaction to things. And if they can game it, and they know how to game it, they're going to get a lot out of it. And so that's really, and to bring in the social media piece, then you bring in the social media piece, which weaponizes it and makes it, so easy to distribute and get it in front of people and engage people in that way. It just sort of feeds on itself. And that's, for right now, it feels like part of the most dangerous part from my perspective.
And we have a question from Paul. When I hear of a conspiracy, I would like to get the facts to prove or disprove the conspiracy, but how do I get the facts that are in fact true?
You should watch episode 5. That one deals a lot with misinformation. It's really challenging, and I think this is a difficult thing to say out loud. I think even friends of mine don't always appreciate this statement when I make it, but we used to have gatekeepers and very few news sources and a shared sense of reality, and that system wasn't perfect. Obviously journalists are human beings and they make mistakes, but it's great that the media has been democratized in such a way that anyone can have a voice, but it's also terrible because there are no gatekeepers. And the fact of the matter is that people who work in mainstream journalism outlets do have to study journalism. They do have to prove that they can tell fact from fiction and work their way up the ladder. They do have editors and fact checkers in their organization. Like, there's accountability built into the mainstream media. I think people have really lost faith in that, but it's still better than 99.9% of the stuff on YouTube, right? So I think actually we need to restore some faith in the mainstream media, which may not be perfect, but if you just kind of think about it statistically, your chances of getting true information from either a reputable fact-checking site like PolitiFact, factcheck.org, Snopes, or a reputable news outlet that's been around for 30 years, that, it's very difficult to get a job as a journalist for the, writing for the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, right? So I find myself actually consuming a lot more of that content and a lot less blogs and YouTube channels and, everyday people who may sound brilliant to me, but I don't have any true way of knowing if what they write on Medium or say on YouTube is actually true.
And I think this really reflects a much broader issue as well, which is just the sort of the fall of expertise, and that everybody today could be an expert because they can Google something or do their own research. Where I don't want to even ask Joe how many years of schooling and study and research and papers and peer checked journals, all that work that you do, Joe, to become an expert in your field. And then somebody comes along and says, nope, this is what it is because I think it is, or because I read something about it. So more broadly, we're expertise is losing its authority, and that has its own repercussions.
I always tell my students, I'm a professor at Boston University, a blogger and a journalist are two different things.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, I would just chime in here and just say, check your facts. It's okay for you to, go to your, National Department of Health or what have you to check things out yourself if you don't feel like you're getting the right answers from NPR or PBS or, like you said, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, etc. So I think we have 2 minutes. Goodness gracious. So in these last 2 minutes, Kristin, do you want to give us a little bit of a preview of what we're going to see in the remaining episodes? Because I am going to direct folks to YouTube to take a look at them.
So we touched on some of them, but episode 3 is called Prudent Paranoia. And that's the one about HIV conspiracies and the logic of believing a conspiracy theory when there's a history of conspiratorial behavior. That's episode 3. Episode 4 is about intuition versus reason. And that, for me, was one of the most interesting because it really, we spent some time trying to understand the value of both sides. So it is perhaps surprisingly to some people, not it's all about facts and people need to stop being so emotional. I think the lesson at the end of the day there is you need intuition and you need reason, but the two sides, intuitionists and rationalists, need to learn to communicate with each other a little bit better. Episode 5 is about misinformation and the illusion of understanding, which is kind of similar to the Dunning-Kruger effect, is this idea that we all think we know more than we know. So we explore that in episode 5. And the last episode is about stories, the stories we tell ourselves. And this was in many ways the most challenging. I saw that somebody wrote in, how can we train the media to not glom onto conspiracy theories and promote them the way that they do? And I think the challenge for them is that they have to provide what readers want if they want to stay in business. And human beings are totally wired to gravitate towards stories that have heroes and villains and a nice 3-act structure and the good guys win. And so the media is often forced to try and fit things into that structure, and conspiracy theorists do the same thing. And in many conspiracy narratives, the conspiracy theorist is the hero, right? They're the hero of their own story, trying to shine a light on conspiracies and bring other people into the tent and help everyone rise up and overthrow the dark forces that are secretly controlling things. So that's what the last episode is about. It's an exploration of, from a character standpoint, some people who've really fully gone down the rabbit hole and done some very damaging things. But the cognitive foible is that connection between story and conspiracy thinking.
Excellent. Thank you very much. That's Kristin Pichaske, Danny Alpert, Joe Uscinski. Thank you so much. This was Pulling the Thread. We appreciate all of you. And if you want to see the episodes that Kristin just previewed, please go to YouTube. All 6 episodes are now streaming. I'm Tina Martin. Have a great night, and thank you so much for joining us. Take care.
Thank you.
Okay.